Greetings, fellow geeks, nerds, and everybody alike. Welcome to the Tech Pod. Today, I want to talk about something a little more personal. I want to talk about my all-time favorite games. So, I've been playing games as far back as I can remember. I'm in my late 20s. I think the very first game that I ever played was on my dad's Sega Genesis growing up. And then later on, as my very first console of my own, I got a Nintendo GameCube and a Game Boy Advance. And since then, I have played many, many games in my life. And I want to talk about the ones that have had a lasting impact. So I've compiled a list of 8 games in my all-time favorite list that I want to talk about. And none of these games are in any particular order in terms of which ones I like the best. It's just my overall favorite games that I played over the years. Why only 8? Because I said so. So, anyways, let's get started. I think we'll start with one of the first games that ended up becoming one of my all-time favorites. And that was Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on the Sega Genesis. So, my dad had a Sega Genesis when I was growing up. And I remember watching him play that game all the time. And it was just some of the most fond memories that I have growing up with my dad. He told me that he beat the game once before I was even born. And I was like, wow, that's so cool. Could you do it again? And for the next few years after that, he pretty much picked the game back up and tried to make it all the way to the end in front of me. He got really, really close a few times. But unfortunately, he just couldn't recreate that a second time. But it was still an amazing time just watching him play. And it was even more fun when I got to play with him via the two-player mode. So I'm not really interested in the newer Sonic games, nothing against them. But god damn, there's just something about the classic Sonic games back on the Sega Genesis. Oh my god, they are just such amazing platformers. And for some reason, the second game is my all-time favorite. No, not the first one, not even the third one, the second one. The second one is the one that I always end up coming back to constantly. I make it a tradition to play through the game at least once every year. And pretty much every time I pick it up it feels like the first time all over again. I know that game like the back of my hand. It still kicks my ass, especially with the last few zones, but I still enjoy that game. And every time I boot it up, I think about those memories of watching my dad play Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and just getting to experience real gaming for the very first time. Next on the list, and one that I also watched my dad play growing up, is Half-Life on the PC. So, if anybody is a gamer, you probably know that Half-Life is one of the all-time best first-person shooters. And even though it came out all the way back in 1998, it is still a fantastic game to play. And it's also a game that I was way too young to be watching my dad play. That's for sure. I thought the game was cool. I did feel like it was a little on the heavy side of subject matter, considering it was an M-rated game. And it also, kind of freaked me out to a certain extent. The head crabs and, for some reason, G-Man were the two things from that game that absolutely freaked me out. and was one of the reasons why I actually didn't end up playing the game on my own for the first time until I was about like 18 or so. And the first time I played it was on my PlayStation 2, which, fun fact, was the only official console port that Half-Life ever got. It was also supposed to come out on Sega Dreamcast, but it was canceled last minute before it was ever finished. I played through the game quite a few times on all three difficulties, and yeah, it's a fantastic game. And no surprise why it's on my list of my favorite games of all time. It's a classic. There's just something so memorable about the storytelling, the environments, that intro sequence with the tram ride and the resonance cascade. It's no wonder why it's a first person shooter that is still played to this day. And I played the remake Black Mesa recently, and as great as that is, I actually prefer the original to a certain extent. There's something about the original game that just keeps me coming back. It is a fantastic first-person shooter. Moving on next to a game that I legit played hundreds of hours of growing up was Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube. I absolutely love that game. It was one of the first games that I played when I first got my GameCube, and if I'm really being honest, I felt like kind of a badass knowing that it had a teen rating and I was only 9 at the time playing it. Like, yeah, it's a very mild teen rating by today's standards, but like at the time seeing that rating on there and I was only 9 years old, I'm like, oh, I'm playing a mature game. Anybody who's ever played Smash Bros. Can probably guess why this is on my list. It's just, there's just something special about it. The amount of content that's in that game, the legacy that it's had on the fighting genre, and the fantastic multiplayer experience. It is just a game that I will never, ever, ever get tired of. And as great as the new Smash Bros. Games are, I'll be honest, I don't think there will ever be another game in the series that will reach the heights that Super Smash Bros. Melee did. Next game on my list is New Super Mario Bros. For the Nintendo DS. And this one is special to me personally. So, growing up, I was going through some family issues at the time, and it was just kind of a rough time in my childhood. But I do remember one thing that helped me cope with some of the toughest years of my childhood. And that was my good old Nintendo DS in 2006. Going from the original Game Boy Advance that had no backlit screen and AA batteries to the Nintendo DS Lite with its beautiful bright screen and rechargeable battery, like, it was a mind-blowing upgrade. I absolutely loved my Nintendo DS. One of the very first games that I got for it was a little game called New Super Mario Bros. And funny enough, it was actually the very first Mario game I had ever played. At that time, I was unfamiliar with Mario, so seeing the new in the title, I thought it just meant like, oh, it's a new game. I didn't realize at the time the significance that that game would have on the Mario series. It was the same running and jumping 2D platforming of the original Mario Bros. With a fresh new coat of paint. And yeah, it is a fantastic platformer. And, with it being so personal to me and having such an impact on me in my childhood, there's a good reason why it is on my list of all-time favorite games. I have so many great memories of staying up way too late trying to beat that game. And I especially remember the mini games. Oh, yes, the mini games. The mini games were an absolute blast to play with my family. Oh my god, it was such it was such a fun experience. I'll never forget, we were on a camping trip and I legit stayed up until almost 3 o'clock in the morning. I was on the final level of that game, and when I finally beat the boss, just the sheer like accomplishment that I felt was just amazing. Considering now that I think about it, I think that was one of the very first games that I ever like finished to the end on my own, and it was just an amazing it was an amazing feeling when I made it to the end and I'm like, "Holy shit. I did that? I did that." It is a game that is definitely worthy of being one of my all-time favorites. And fun fact, I still have my original copy of the game that I first got in 2006 and still play it a lot. Up next, we have Super Mario Galaxy for the Nintendo Wii. And oh boy, this game was phenomenal. So, I think it was one of the first like mainline entry Mario games that I had played, and just the sheer scope of that game with the different planets that you could go to, or the different galaxies, I should say, that you could go to, the intuitive motion controls, and that amazing orchestral soundtrack. Like, yeah, I love this game. It is one that I will never get tired of. And even today, it's a game that still holds up great. Up next is a game that you've probably never heard of, and I can't blame you. It's called Zapper One Wicked Cricket for the PC. Um, yeah, this one's kind of a weird one. I played a lot of this one growing up with my brother, and two things stand out to me that I remember. One, it was a blatant Frogger ripoff, and two, it was a very, very mediocre game. Like, honestly, nothing all that special was going on with it. But for some reason, I loved it, despite how mediocre it was. I have no idea why. Some of that may just be nostalgia. I don't really know. But every time that I come back to it, despite all of its flaws, I still enjoy it and have flashbacks of those great memories that I had with my brother playing the game. And plus, I just thought the idea of a cricket that can produce electricity with its little like antennas was just a really weird concept. Next up on my list is SSX Tricky for the PlayStation 2. Oh, this is a fantastic game. I love this game. And it kind of makes me sad that there aren't more games like it to this day. So, growing up in the early 2000s, there was something about those games at that time that really stood out when it came to the like overall aesthetic and character to those games. It was very over the top, especially when it came to the EA Sports big games, or I'm sorry, EA Sports Big. SSX Tricky was the second game in the SSX franchise by EA, and it is well known for being a super stylish, super over-the-top arcade snowboarding game, and it is a fantastic one. The game is definitely a product of its time in a good way. There's a lot of different characters to play as, each with their own different personalities. I love just the over the top tricks that you can do in that game, and plus, not to mention the amazing soundtrack that game has as well. It's one that I still play to this day. I love SSX Tricky. Please, EA, make another one, or at least remaster it. I'll buy it. Please, we need another SSX game. And the final game on my list that I want to talk about is Infamous for the PlayStation 3. So, I grew up with a Wii during the 7th generation, so I never really got to experience any of the other consoles like the PS3 and Xbox 360. I actually didn't end up getting my own PS3 until about 2016 when I was moving off to college. Mainly because they were really cheap at the time, and also I was looking for a Blu-ray player. So I looked at a PS3 and I'm like, hey, it's a game console, it's a Blu-ray player. Sure, why not? And one of the very first games that I picked up for it was a game called Infamous. It was an action game made by Sucker Punch, the same people who made the Sly Cooper series on the PS2. And it's a game that is heavily inspired by a lot of the Batman DC comics, and it certainly shows. You have a main character that's overly serious and has a really gritty voice, has amazing superpowers, and most importantly, also has a karma mechanic where you can either play the game as the good guy or the bad guy. And I loved that part of the game. You'll be playing through main story missions, and in certain parts of those missions, it'll kind of stop the action and basically put you in a place where you can either choose a action that gives you good karma, or you can choose the other one that gives you evil karma. And depending on which one you choose will affect the outcome of the game. It is such a great action game. It is one of my favorite PS3 games, and even though it has certainly aged a little bit, I do still love it and play it a lot to this day despite all of its flaws. And I really, really hope that they end up making another one, or at least making a remaster on PS5. Like, I will legit buy that day one if they make another one. I want another Infamous game so badly. So, there we have it. That was my list of my all-time favorite games. Like I said, they were in no particular order, and I figured it would just be a really fun topic to talk about in this series. But definitely let me know what you thought, and maybe even talk about your own favorite games in the comments. But that's it for now. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all next time.